Good afternoon and welcome back to the Fastly YouTube channel for the 14th episode of Fastly Developers Live. Today I'm here with my fantastic team. I have Kevin, Katz and Dora, and my name is Kalen, and this is the developer relations team here at Fastly. Now, hopefully you've been on our community forum and you've had a chance to check out the thread where we've been asking for your feedback on fastly.toml. And that's because although we're the developer experience team, there's one group of people whose feedback about our developer experience is most important, and that is you, our developer community. So we want to involve you over the next few weeks as we build the newest iteration of our compute package manifest, or as you may know it, fastly.toml. If you've placed your feedback onto our forum thread, then we're going to be taking a look at that today. But we'll also welcome any feedback that you may have in the chat. So we're keeping an eye on it, and we welcome any comments throughout. We really just want to have an open discussion about the future. Throughout the stream as well, you can also go onto the forum thread and post your feedback. We'd also love to hear it over the next week as we keep the thread open. We will be closing this at the end of next week though, so make sure you get your feedback in quickly. So, before we start, Dora, would you like to give us a brief overview of what the fastly.toml currently is?
Of course. So, fastly.toml is the configuration metadata file for Fastly Compute. It lives in the root directory of every one of your compute projects, and it houses a bunch of important information about it in terms of attribution, like the name, the authors, code provenance, the service ID. But you may not know that fastly.toml also lets you do a bunch of cool, powerful stuff, like customize the build process that the Fastly CLI uses to compile and upload your project to compute. It can let you set up your local server configuration or bootstrap your production service, and it can even help you work with environment variables. For a helpful reference of all of these features, you can head over to fastly.com documentation and search for fastly.toml. Now, as Kieran said, we asked you to provide some input on the future of fastly.toml, and we're going to look at some of the things you've been saying. The most popular request by far has been something along the lines of moving to another language. You've been saying that you'd like something that's easier to write with less verbose nesting than TOML. You'd like better tooling so that the CLI doesn't have to rewrite the file constantly. Perhaps you would want to manipulate this file with commands rather than editing it directly. And some of the other suggestions were using JSON or even JSON5, or adopting a multi-format, supporting TOML or JSON or something completely new. What do we think about this team?
I do quite like the idea of a multi-format. So I think you brought this up yesterday, which was how ESLint allows you to write your configuration in JSON or as a JavaScript file, which then allows you to kind of put some properties in dynamically. It does sound interesting, but I'm not sure if there's any demand. I mean, would either of you find that helpful?
Possibly. The ability to have you write some logic in there that could respond to variables you set in the environment, for example, or something like that could definitely be useful.
That makes sense. But then are we perhaps overcomplicating it with
That's right.
a whole execution environment?
Right, exactly.
Or we could go multiple levels deep and have a WASM component that lets you configure how you build your other WASM component.
That's right, yes.
What do we think about JSON being a choice in general? Does that seem sensible? When I first suggested that, it came from a place of, well, a lot of our developers are using JavaScript and they're used to the package.json. I personally am not a huge fan of the deep nesting that we currently have with TOML. And also there's a pretty common frustration, which is that when you use the Fastly CLI to do something compute related, it actually makes your TOML more verbose in most cases. And the reason for that is that we only have a few options in Go, which the CLI is written in, to pass TOML, and especially to modify it and rewrite it. So it gets passed into a syntax tree, which we can then work on. But when that gets written back to the file afterwards, it's missing all of the information about indentation, and it just ends up being a bit messy, as I'm sure you've all experienced.
So you end up with no indentation and repetitive names in all of the nested blocks.
Right.
Yes.
But that's not a requirement for TOML.
Right.
Each nested block will have the header, which isn't required as long as you have the header for
Gotcha.
the subsections.
Okay.
So using something like JSON, we would, first of all, the syntax for that is much more concise, and you can't do a lot of things differently.
Yes.
On top of that, Go has decent support for JSON and will allow us to modify it without changing the structure, as does pretty much every other language out there.
Let me pull that back a bit to developer experience. Hands up if you've edited package.json by hand.
Yeah.
Okay, so safe to say we're all comfortable with editing JSON. Now, have you considered that the way in which we define local server configuration for things like KV store entries might be a little bit at odds with this? Because escaping JSON strings is one of the things I absolutely despise having to do. Just for consideration, we're not trying to solutionize here. We're trying to discuss all of these wonderful options. And I've really enjoyed reading the forum thread. And if any of this sparks your interest now, please drop us a note, go and check out the forum thread, and let us know what you think as we discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's a language that you may have thought of that we haven't, we'd love to hear that. I think, again, everyone in the forum thread has said, yes, JSON would be great, including Mark, who has maintained the CLI for many years. He's a very vocal supporter of moving to JSON. But, I mean, anything that has those properties of wide support, easy human configurability, these would be good options.
That rules out XML.
Maybe not XML. Yeah, that's
That last part, easy human editing, that's where that would be a problem. Yeah.
I have heard someone say YAML.
yeah. I know Andrew wanted YAML, or he didn't want it, but when he was providing suggestions for the format, he typed it in YAML because it was quicker for him. I thought, maybe that's saying something.
Yep.
Someone also brought up that YAML natively has support for includes, right?
That's this JSON actually. You can use references to include JSON from other files, but then we would have to pre-process that and bundle it. That's on us, however, so we're just open to hearing how you'd prefer to work with this file. And some of you have indeed said that you prefer to not have to touch it at all, and you'd like to manipulate it with commands. I don't know, I imagine something like fastly compute config set value equals something else. And you'd want to do that rather than editing the file directly. So this is perhaps another interesting thing to consider.
Yeah, and that reminds me of Cargo, the Rust build tool as well. You can write cargo add, and it will add a dependency to your TOML rather than having to go in and edit it manually, which is always nice.
Equivalent of npm install.
Exactly,
Yes.
yeah. And if we did that, it also doesn't matter what language we're choosing, because that is just a way that will make it an easier experience all around.
So, kind of brainstorming on that idea, could we even provide libraries that you could write your own programs to manipulate the contents of this file and not even have to use the CLI via subprocess and child execution and all of that?
That is a good point, because currently the CLI has to modify this file, which is Go, so we already have a wrapper for manipulating it in Go. I know we have Rust tooling that also uses this file,
Right.
so that's two already. And I think this leads on to a point that you were making, Dora, about defining this with JSON schema, which would actually allow, it would make it a lot easier for us to build interfaces that use the data and manipulate the data.
So this is an experiment I have completed or almost completed very recently. It's writing a full JSON schema specification of all the possible properties and formats of fastly.toml in its current shape. And working with this might allow us to iterate a lot quicker It might allow us to experiment with the kinds of tools that we would like to see us supporting in the future. And if we actually make that open source, perhaps the community might want to contribute their own tools.
Sure.
The reason that I wrote this schema was in order to write an IDE extension that would allow you to edit this file without writing into it directly. That's one of the things that I'm experimenting with at the moment. But I'm always happy to hear from you, and you might have better ideas on the application of it, such as schema to make it public. I don't see why we can't actually do this. We do document fastly.toml. It's just providing that documentation in a different and machine consumable format.
Right. Which then leads to the ability to create tools based on that.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent.
Okay.
Fantastic. Did anyone else have anything they'd like to mention about selecting a language, or should we move on to the big question?
The big question. The big question and a recurring theme of discussions about the configuration metadata file of Fastly Compute is whether to treat it as resources or infrastructure as code. And there have been a few suggestions around this topic. One would be merging local server and setup into one property. What would that mean? I'm struggling to see it. I read the suggestion. I'm still struggling to imagine this.
Sure. So I can maybe hold myself responsible here because I created the setup section. It was, I think, about 3 years ago, and I was building a tool that would take a GitHub repository with a Fastly Compute project in it, and you would click a button, just like the deploy to Heroku button that I'm sure we all used back when that was the hip thing to do. And you click the button and it would prompt you for information about the resources required. So it would say, this requires a backend named protected bucket. What do you want the host name and the port to be? Or this requires a dictionary, which was our predecessor to config stores. What would you like the keys and values to be? And in order to do that, there had to be some kind of format for the tool to recognize the dependencies of the service. Right. Heroku had app.json, which was a file that defined all of those kind of configuration values. And we already had the fastly.toml. So I thought, okay, let's design a new section that goes into the fastly.toml to define those requirements. I made that as a side project and put it in a few of my projects, and people thought, oh, that works really well, that's helpful. And it eventually became this kind of informal standard that then became a formal standard as we introduced it as the setup section and added support for it to the CLI, which now prompts you to create the backends and resources required. And that was really, really good. But the key point was this would only define the requirements, but not their actual configuration values. And that's not helpful for actually running the service with the local testing server, because you can't just tell the local testing server, I need a backend named protected bucket. You actually have to give it the information to connect to that backend.
Right.
So a new section was introduced by the team that worked on the local testing server called local server. And it works well. I mean, I think everyone building on Compute has used this section, and even more so than the setup section, because setup tends to only be used in public examples. But for those people that do use both, you now have duplicate sets of configuration in your fastly.toml. One that's defining the things that need to exist, and one that's actually defining their values, but neither of them actually have anything to do with each other. This is clearly not the right way forward, but we need to find a way to now define resources, both in a way that could allow the user to configure them upon setup. For example, if you had a config store with a list of paths and paths you need to redirect to, or some cases where you actually require a certain key and value to be in the config store for the app to work. So not only do you need the structure of these resources, but also a way to define whether the values are required. I'm not entirely sure of the best way to do that. And it sounds like everyone has their own thought on it, which is why this is a great forum to discuss it.
Absolutely, and we'd love to know what you think. So there are a couple of more subtle challenges around merging local server and setup configurations. The way we use setup right now is to bootstrap a compute service. I personally have been very, very grateful for the setup property. I had this demo on doing OAuth 2 authentication at the edge that required quite a complex setup script. And I was so happy when setup became a thing in production, and it now just works and I don't need to include a bash script in my package. So for a lot of resources, local server and setup, even though the properties are slightly different, the formatting is slightly different, they can be used interchangeably, except for secret stores. We can't bootstrap secret stores that way, or secret stores values. We can bootstrap secret stores, but we can't actually update secrets. And that leads me to my next point, which is how do we merge this and make it more useful and avoid becoming Terraform?
Right. And
Folks have asked, like, okay, do we just want to use this as a bootstrapping solution? Or do we want continuous synchronization? Heavily hinting that they would prefer continuous synchronization.
this is true. So a lot of the people that we have spoken to have said, I would love for all of the resources to stay in sync with the config file. If you're not aware, we do provide a Terraform provider that allows you to do this. And yes, Terraform is an incredibly complex tool. We definitely don't want to sit here and recreate that. However, there's probably a good middle ground between initializing the resources on the first deploy and potentially notifying you if they've changed in the config but haven't changed on your service on the fast control panel.
Right.
I'm curious if either of you have any thoughts about how you would envision this.
Okay, so my personal take on this would be that it would be really cool if the shape of your data, for what's required. We now need a config store name for this, or we now need a activity store name for this, or something. Things of that nature would get reflected, but for example, not their contents. So that would start destroying stuff potentially on future deploys, and that would be something that I would be worried about. But having the shape of the stores and the stuff get automatically synced would be awesome, because as you develop your code and you realize, oh, I need a new store, you just add it to your TOML file, and then, or whatever it ends up being, but you then your next deploy, because it's going to work on your local development now because it's in your TOML file. Then now your production gets updated to meet that. That would be awesome.
Right, so you can see that you may already have a service set up,
Yes.
but since then there's been a new config store
correct.
added, and that should then be
Yes.
automatically created, or
Possibly, or maybe you can maybe we can agree on certain arguments you pass to the publish command or something that would do that. However, you probably do not want to, if there's data that's already there on the production, you don't want to be overwriting that kind of data. Right? You only want to be manipulating the schema, not really schema, but the existence of certain stores, for example, but not necessarily overwriting their data, if that makes sense.
yeah, and also then you start to get into complex territory of Terraform,
Yes.
where
Yes.
you're managing state both in the cloud and in a state file, and then also in the configuration.
Right.
Any thoughts yourself, Kevin?
Yeah, so I've had weird thoughts there because I frequently have weird thoughts about these things. I mean, Terraform exists, so it's not impossible that we could say we have determined based on your package manifest that the current state on the cloud does not match your requirements. We're not going to change it in the CLI. However, we can run Terraform for you if you've set up the appropriate Terraform configuration. Possibly even ask Terraform what changes would it make and warn you if it turns out that it thinks it's going to need to delete something. Stop right there. The goal really for me is we don't want to publish the new package binary. until all of this has been determined. You definitely don't want that binary uploaded to the production network if there's any chance that its requirements aren't met. So if that's, we can start there. We don't necessarily have to reshape the production network to match the requirements, but we can at least warn you, we shouldn't upload this unless you tell us to, because there's no config store named this, and you've told us that one is required. So that's where I would like to start. And if we end up saying, now go run Terraform to make that happen, and come back and run the publish command again, and now it passes because those requirements or resources exist, you're in a good space.
That's an interesting approach. So perhaps we would almost be recommending that users go to Terraform.
Or something similar, OpenTofu or Pulumi or whatever they like. It doesn't have to be Terraform in particular, but yeah.
Right. So more of a kind of guiding method
Yes.
than actually just saying, yeah, we'll do it all for you.
Right.
Because right now it's kind of, you're just expected to know that these resources have to exist.
Right.
But recognizing that you have to say that the package depends on them, but then it's up to you to get them to be created on the
Right.
back end. We can guide you. We can send you to the documentation site where we have a page that talks about managing resources.
Yeah.
Um,
And as soon as you're a compute service, as soon as you aren't the only person working on your compute service, as soon as it moves from one person to more than one person, now managing the state, like you mentioned, what was the state the last time we looked becomes very, very important. You can't just use the desired state and the current state as the only two inputs, because you could end up breaking things, especially if someone else has made a change since the last time you looked. That's why Terraform manages what was the last state when I last touched everything. It remembers all of that. So we don't want to go in that. I don't think we want the CLI to have to learn how to do that.
Of course. Okay.
I don't mean to make it even more complicated, but these kinds of things are linked resources, which means they can actually be accessed by more than one service.
True.
Which means you would definitely almost never want, for example, now that I've removed this store from this project setup file, and then you deploy it and then that gets deleted, would be a very bad thing.
Right.
In many cases, it's possible that other services you've written are going to be referencing those.
At the most, that would act as an unmake.
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Right.
So this is why the setup that this property really works as a bootstrapping feature. And these are some of the challenges that we might, if we were to consider continuous synchronization with your production service.
Yeah.
Also, never mind that you're able to edit these resources in any number of ways. You can log into your Fastly app.
Right.
You can use the Fastly CLI. You can use Terraform. You can make an API call. And
Yep.
yeah, it gets really, really complicated really quickly.
Yep.
And it's interesting that you talked a little bit about enabling certain things, because we're going to talk about that in a bit. But I just wanted to raise another point under the infrastructure as code umbrella and resources stuff. You've been asking for separate config files for environments. And
Yes.
I think you were asked about this. Okay?
It was actually Kevin that asked,
Yes.
this was your comment when I first said to you, you know, I asked you quite what seemed like a silly question. I said, why am I here? Why have I been tasked to reach out to the community and create a fastly
Sure.
common? What's wrong with the current one? And the first thing that you brought up was the resources, but then immediately after that you said, you really want to have multiple sets of resources. So if you find a bug in one configuration, you can continuously test the new versions against
Right.
that.
Exactly. And in that case, it's multiple sets of example data for the same resources. So if you found that your code misbehaves when a KV store value has a certain content that you didn't expect to be there, and you say, well, okay, I'm going to fix the code so that it behaves correctly when it encounters that situation, as a good programmer, you should write some sort of regression test so that you don't have a future regression and that code disappears and now it begins misbehaving again. In order to do that, you have to be able to run the program in a known environment where that bad value exists. So if we're going to do this with local testing, as we generally do, you're going to have to say, this is, let's say you use Jira. It's Jira ticket 1461. That's where this bug was reported when we fixed it. Let's set up an environment that replicates that issue so that every single time we do continuous integration on a new version of our code, we can make sure that bug hasn't reappeared. So that could be a whole bunch of different things that have to be, the config stores have to have certain values, the KV stores have to have certain values, and a bunch of other things all have to be in place. But as a developer managing this, you want to be able to give that combination a name that has meaning to you so that you can then say, hey, the test for 1461 failed. It hasn't failed for 3 months. Why did it start failing yesterday? Someone go look at the code and figure out what happened.
I can see a lot of value in this, actually. Back to a more basic use case. For me, I would love to be able to have a config file where I can say, here are my test backends. I don't want to change the code to know that I need to access
Right.
the test backends.
Right.
I want you to use this configuration file that knows to load the test environment variables from the .env.test file, or knows to run the specific pre-build script that I have given it, that does certain things that I only need to do for my test environment.
Sure.
So yeah, there is a case for fuzzing and testing, and there's also a case for this is how I want to work with compute in very basic terms. So I really like the idea of having separate config files.
That back end thing made, we use http-me.glitch.me a lot for testing these kinds of things, because you can make it send you a 200 or a 302 or a 503 or whatever. And you would like to be able to say, okay, I want to run the same request through the code and have the backend intentionally send me a 503 response without having to touch the code.
Yeah.
So if you could do that by having a test environment that you know will force that to happen, now you can test that path through your code and make sure that it works correctly.
Okay.
It sounds to me like we've all kind of separately come to a conclusion that we haven't directly mentioned, but I think we all understand that there needs to be a place where the definitions of what's required exist.
Yeah.
You don't want to then be redefining all of that again for each set of data that
Right.
fills those in. So we're almost kind of going back to this setup versus local server
Yes.
distinction,
Yeah.
but it would be more than just local server. You would have a list of the requirements for the package, and then one or more sets of
Yes.
configuration that fill those in.
Right.
And you could perhaps use those both with the local server or as part of the deployment to create those resources
Sure.
the first time. And at that point, we've kind of ticked all of the boxes, minus the continuous synchronization,
Right.
which is,
Which scares us all.
it's very scary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if we can get to the point right before the point of continuous synchronization, I would personally think that is quite a delightful experience already.
It certainly is. And we can make it easy to eject to Terraform as well.
Mhm.
So that, when you get to that point where you've built an application and you're now shipping it to production and you want multiple environments and you want them to be in config files, you can kind of graduate to the next step.
Sure.
Yeah.
Some enterprising community member could take our library that reads the config file and writes a Terraform configuration file for you.
It's a very good
It
point.
certainly could be done.
If anyone wants to do that, please get it.
We would love that.
Absolutely. So we're talking about packages and services, and one of the things that I haven't figured out a way to do, because I don't just have my Fastly account, I have a test account where I put things that I'm embarrassed about and I don't want to share with you. And I'll often forget to enable the store or a beta feature. And that's required for my code to work. And then I spend some time figuring out why my code doesn't work, because the resource wasn't created. Why wasn't it created? Because I've not been able to create that resource. Is there scope for that being configured in fastly.toml, or what do we think?
So this actually was something that Carter brought up, right?
Yes, that's
Because
right.
Cuts joined us from the Fanout team
Yes.
back when we made that acquisition,
Yes.
and you are naturally working with it a lot. So how have you found this difficult?
Yes. So often, coming as Kevin said, I'm coming from the fan out background. I would be writing backends, and then the way compute works is you would create a compute service that would act as your fan out proxy. And in order to do that, you would write a compute program that says, I want to take this incoming request and then forward it to fan out. And then I would build that and deploy it to my production Fastly for this. But the trouble is that when I publish my application, fan out actually has to be enabled for that service before this actually starts working. So it would be Fastly, if you use the CLI, Fastly compute publish is the normal command. And then after Fastly compute publish runs even the first time, which by the way, first time it runs, it will wait until the thing comes online by pinging it for a couple minutes until it comes online.
Oh,
But actually that never
that won't
happens.
come online.
It never
Right.
appears to come online because fan out is not enabled. And so in order to do that, we actually have to wait for that to fail, or I guess we can control C out of it. But once that happens, I've already Fastly compute publish, but I have to Fastly products enable fan out. That's fine, but I've kind of wasted this version. Versions are cheap, no big
Yeah,
deal,
sure.
but I have this version up there that doesn't really work, and then I have to enable fan out for this new version, and then the trouble is that you don't really, when you publish it with the first time, then that's when you get the wizard for building the new service. It asks you for the backends and all that stuff. You want to do that anyway, but you can't enable the service before you do that because it doesn't have a service ID. So you
Right.
have to publish it first. It gives you a service ID, then you get a service that doesn't run yet, then you enable it. So that's the trouble. So what I was suggesting possibly was a way in this fastly.toml to say, you know what, this service, when you look at the fastly.toml file, it will say in there that this service is going to require that. And just by saying that, whoever's reading the code can know that this relies on fan out. There's other products that you can enable that way as well. Certain things are only for deliver, so you aren't going to be like enabling image optimizer, but for things like fan out, you would have to enable. And by seeing it in there, that fan out is going to be required, we can have, for example, when you first deploy it, you can either possibly enable it automatically, or we can give you information
Sure.
saying we need this. Make sure you buy fan out, for example.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Or you start the free trial because you're going to need it for this service. You can advertise that the service is going to require this product, and I think that would be a great add-on to this fastly.toml, just so that the human reading the project or the CLI when it processes it will know that that's required, and then we can do something with it.
Right. Because right now, when you run Fastly compute publish and it just hangs while it waits for it to come online, you don't know that it's because fan out is not enabled.
Correct.
You
Yeah.
will have to dig into the logs and figure out that that's the case, and then find out why fan out's not enabled.
Yes.
If we could say to you, you're deploying this project, but it requires fan out to be enabled. Here's how you enable it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a much better position
Sure,
already.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this, Kevin?
Well, I would say here's how to enable it. You have fan out enabled on your customer account. You need it on this service. Would you like us to enable it for you? And you say yes, and then it does it, and then publishes a new version, or even does that before it activates the version you were trying to publish.
Yes, exactly.
And then
that's
that way you don't even waste a version at all. Right. Yes.
I think we're all in agreement that this is a good idea.
Yeah.
So the way fastly.toml is structured right now is into audit type metadata and descriptors. And even if we had that kind of property just for audit purposes to tell you, like,
Yes.
hey, you need to remember to enable your service with the following features.
Right.
I think that's already immediately very, very helpful. And then, yeah, there are other properties that help you with bootstrapping and setup and build
Sure.
process.
And this goes back to the thing you were talking about having a test account for products that have to be enabled at the account level, not at the service level, like KV Store, for example. If you're trying to experiment with a new version of your compute service and you've created a test account to do that, you have KV Store enabled on your main account, but you've not yet enabled it on your test account. When you go try to deploy it, it should be able to tell you, not only does this KV Store not exist in your account, I can't even create it for you because you haven't enabled the KV Store product yet. Can we do that now? Yes. Okay, then you can move on with the rest of the steps.
I like it. I think this is a really valuable input. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for showing it on the forum as well.
Yeah.
It was great to see that.
Now, I was really happy to see a suggestion from the Glitch community. And this is all about integration with Glitch. So there was a request for having some kind of config to spin up compute services from Glitch. Do you have any more information about it?
Yes, so I spoke to Sue earlier today, who was the person that made that suggestion, just to get a little bit more info about what they're talking about. This actually has been solved by what we've been talking about earlier with the resources, because what Glitch needs to be able to do when it spins up a service that is fronting a Glitch app is take an existing compute project but deploy it with a slightly different configuration for each Glitch app. The backend needs to be different. I think there are other properties that it needs. Now, with what we've suggested now, the Glitch backend could theoretically use the library that manipulates the configuration file to generate a configuration file with the resources that that service requires, and then they can just run the fastly CLI publish command, pass in that file, and a Glitch service now has a fastly service in front of it.
Nice.
I think that is all that is needed to enable this, and we've kind of ticked the box because actually this is just a core requirement of deploying different environments to a compute platform.
Okay, so we've solved this by agreeing that we're going to have more config files.
Yeah.
So when you go on glitch.com in the future and you put remix on a project, it will be very, very easy to just put a fastly service in front of it. I love it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sue, for the input.
Yes.
Much appreciated. I'm just having a look at what else we have to talk about. I would love a chance in a moment to just read through some of the posts on the forum thread, just to get the more specific input from our community. But I wanted to bring up something that was mentioned in a meeting that we just had with the team that works on the compute platform. And this is something that I don't think any of us had considered, but is really interesting, which is the idea that you could ask the local testing server to occasionally just error when you request something like a config store value or a geolocation lookup. And they described it as a chaos monkey, which is quite a common term for this within the industry. But we would intentionally allow you to configure things in a broken way so that you can test your application's resilience to it. I'm kind of curious how this would work, because there's the possibility that for each config store, you could say, okay, return an error 50% of the time. You could alternatively just say, for config stores in general, return an error 50% of the time. The thing I'm wondering is if this is relevant to the configuration of a specific service, or whether this is just a parameter that you pass to the local testing server when you run it. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Actually, that makes more sense. I'm not really sure of what's the utility of testing the case where just this KV store fails.
Right.
That's kind of bizarre, yeah.
Well, you could ask your origin to arbitrarily
Yes,
fail
that one makes
50%
sense,
of the
yes.
time.
So with
Sure.
origins, that might be worth it. But
Or to take 10 seconds when it normally takes 500 milliseconds,
Yeah.
or some other sort of thing like that. Right.
I'd actually really like to hear from you how you stress test your compute services.
Yeah.
That'd be really interesting.
Yes.
So you can pop into our community and just drop us a note if this Chaos Monkey feature speaks to you, and if you'd like to see some kind of reference to it in fastly.toml or the local development server.
Yeah, or in just the tool set in general.
Yeah.
Right.
I think this
Right.
actually raises a wider point that I hadn't considered, which is at some point there will be configuration that is only unique to the local testing server.
Right.
This is one of them.
Right.
What we're trying to do is unify all of the configuration that is identical across production and locally. But you're never going to be configuring production fastly to return errors. Right? I don't think that's functionality that we're planning to include.
Right.
So I wonder if configuration that is specific to certain tools, such as the local testing server, would be better off in its own file.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps the local testing server should have its own fastly.toml that only applies to itself.
Sure.
And that way it could be called setup instead of local server.
Setup, yeah. And also, Kevin, you brought up a good point on the forum actually, which is that you don't think many people use local server as a local server. It's not.
Right.
Its purpose isn't to serve, right?
Right.
It's for testing.
It's for testing.
So
Yes.
perhaps using something a bit more accurate to its intended purpose rather than local server.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't want to give people the impression that they should run the local server on their own infrastructure and serve everything through that.
No.
It's,
No.
To be clear, it's not the same performance as
No.
our production
No.
network. It's a different code base. It is purely there for testing. And that's why we're introducing new functionality to that as well, like profiling, which we'll mention briefly at the end. Sorry, I had to stick that in there.
Yes.
Okay, are there any other points that you wanted to bring up before we go through the posts on the forum?
So.
No?
Okay.
Great. I think we're all on the same page about what is needed to bring this to the next level. I'm just going to briefly scan these. Of course, we have read them all. As a team, we've been really appreciative of everyone that provided feedback, and every single point is considered. That's the whole reason that we're doing this. We want to make something that you will find useful rather than just making guesses about the right way to do things.
I do want to mention one thing because I think we overlooked making it clear in the forum post. But to go back to Dora's statement earlier about how we want this to be a delightful experience, whatever we do here, the upgrade's going to be automatic. Someday, when this new thing exists and you upgrade to a new version of the fastest CLI which supports it, and then you run, we don't know which of the commands yet, but we run one of the compute-related commands, it will actually ask you, would you like to convert your existing package manifest to this new format, and then do all of that for you. We're not going to be expecting you to rewrite your existing things into the new format.
Right. That's a very good point. And the upgrade process will be pretty easy.
Should
It's
should
not a
be
hugely
it should be
complex
almost transparent, ideally.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to read a post now from SP at the FT. I do know who this is, but since they haven't used their full name in the username, I'm not going to out them here. He said, I'm a +1 on the whole local versus remote backend config. Simplifying that seems helpful as that whole area is a bit unintuitive for engineers that haven't previously worked with a VCL service and understand the backend concept. This is true. Actually, I think we're all very used to it, but backends on an edge workers platform is a pretty unique concept. I don't know of any other platforms that do that.
Right.
And having these kind of things more well defined in a project configuration will allow us to more easily introduce developers to that concept.
Sure.
The setup section has helped with that, but again, making that simpler and making that adopted more universally across compute projects will have a huge impact. There was a point that he brought up about there's a curious thing here between compute maybe wanting to be a generic hosting platform, but still fundamentally being a reverse proxy. I think we kind of quashed that a bit because compute isn't just a reverse proxy. It's one of the things that it can do, but actually it is a compute platform that will run whatever you need it to. I think this feeling of it being a reverse proxy is coming from the perspective of someone who's been a Fastly customer for a very long time, which we really appreciate, But actually, this is more than just our delivery service. This is the next step up.
Yep.
Yes. We still want to be able to encompass in fastly.toml all of the other use cases for compute. I can't remember the last time I've used the proper backend in compute.
Almost all of your demos generate responses directly.
Yes.
They don't rely on an origin.
Yes, including the machine learning one.
So we have another comment from Wolfgang who has said, since Fastly Compute Deploy only creates resources such as backends, domains, logging endpoints, and does not update them if their configuration changes, we have to use Terraform to control those aspects anyway. I'd love if we didn't have to do that. Now, we have touched on this, of
Right.
course. I think perhaps, like we said, rather than doing what Terraform does, we provide an easier path to starting to use Terraform and make it more compatible with our existing tooling. It would be great to provide a guide for this, which we'll link to the CLI. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this?
The only other thought that comes to mind for me, and then I literally do not know the answer to this because I've never had a reason to look before, but if either Terraform or OpenTofu are available as libraries that can be used from inside another application and wrapped, that could be an interesting approach to say, we're not going to implement this, it's too difficult, too complex for us to implement on our own. But rather than making you go run it separately and deal with the output separately, we might be able to make it an integrated part of the process by just incorporating it as a library into the CLI. So that could be something we could take a look at. And if it's not a thing that currently exists, well, then we can go to those communities and say, hey, have you considered doing this sort of thing for other applications that want to integrate configuration management functionality without having to rebuild it all themselves?
Absolutely. And I think also there's some value here in educating our developer community, especially, we acquired Glitch, we love Glitch, we love the way that people use it to learn. And if we could take some of those amazing ways of teaching and incorporate it into our main platform, that would be incredible. Like by teaching people how they can start to use infrastructure as code tools that are used professionally, we are actually maybe introducing people to infrastructure as code that would never have done it before.
Right.
So yeah, I see immense value there.
Yeah. So, if you're going to go beyond day 0, when you publish your compute service for the first time, you get to day 100 and day 300 and day 500, where you've begun to use things like our observability tools and alerting tools and things like that, and you've understood the behavior of your service and what is normal and what should be considered abnormal. At some point, you're going to say, well, I'd like to set up 3 alerts for if any of these 3 situations occur. Where and how would you choose to do that? Would you just go do it directly in the control panel? Obviously, that's certainly an option. You could say, wouldn't it be great if I could just do it in the same place I'm managing all of the rest of my stuff for the service? I can see why people would want that to be yes, that they want to do it all in one place. We would just need to find a way to be able to do that doesn't. We need to find a way to offer that, which doesn't obligate us to re-implement all of that functionality.
Absolutely. Okay, I believe that's all of the main questions that we have. I'm going to ask if anyone watching has any questions before we wrap up, pop them in the chat and we will absolutely address those now. Does anyone here have anything else that they would like to consider or discuss?
I just want to say that this is by no means the end of the discussion. This should be the beginning of the discussion. We've really enjoyed listening to all of your suggestions, and please keep them coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll pop up the link again. Definitely head over to community.fastly.com. Take a look at the forum thread. It's currently at the top, and you can also scan the QR code that's on your screen. And until the week after next, we will be accepting all feedback and comments here and taking it into consideration as we put together a proposal. And it doesn't end there. We will actually also post our proposal and allow you the chance to comment on it after we've actually proposed a solution. This is not just, give us your feedback and we'll then surprise you with something. This will very much be an iterative process with the community, and
Right.
I'm really looking forward to that. This is the first time we've really done something like this as a company,
Yeah.
where we've gone to our developers and said, what would you like? And you know, that's great for us because we get these opinions and ideas that we maybe never would have had ourselves. And as someone who uses Fastly as a developer, I mean, I build a ton of compute apps. I'm very privileged to be on a team where I get to have a say in those things, but had I had that choice as a customer, I would be so thrilled that
Right.
I'm part of the development of the platform. So definitely head over to the forum, make the most of it. We want to hear everything you have to say.
Yep.
That's all we've got then for today. That's the stream. I want to thank all of you for
Thank
joining
you.
me
Thank you.
today. It's been fantastic, and I'd like to thank everyone watching at home or at their office as well. We appreciate you spending the time with us. I want to quickly plug the YouTube channel. You really need to subscribe because we've got a fantastic stream coming next month. I am going to be joined by the Lord of WebAssembly, Jamie Sharp, who is going to be bringing us some fantastic information about this profiler that he has built. It allows you to profile your services on the local testing server and find ways that you can improve the performance. And that's going to be on Friday the 30th of August at the times on the screen. So do make sure that you join us for that. Apart from that, that is everything. So have a great rest of your day and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.